Hello friends and welcome back to another Learning HTML with me. So today we are going to learn all about forms, and all I have right now is just the HTML. So just my file with a heading and my logo in my folder in case I need it, and then of course my live server is running. If you're not familiar with any of this, I have a video just under an hour that I cover all of this and the basics of HTML. The link of that is in the description. So go watch that one, please. Let's just start with forms. Let me zoom in here so we can see better. Um, of course, I'm sorry. The form element is called form in HTML, and by default VS Code gives us the attribute action, and I'm going to leave it for now, but I will explain. So as an example, I'm just going to create a simple search type form. So it wouldn't really function as a search, but it would look like, and yeah, so that's it really. I mean, this is the simplest form you can see almost anywhere on the internet, and it's a search field where the user is able to search something and get the result, right? So I will cover these later in the video, so whatever is in the form, but for now we're just going to cover and talk about the form element itself. So form, as you can see here, VS Code tells us the form element represents a collection of form associated elements. And what it does, it basically collects user input and data, and then in most cases send them back to the server for evaluation and processing. So we're not going to cover, of course, the back server, the server side of it, because that's a whole new programming language. But for now, we're just going to talk about HTML side of it. So that's the job of the form. And the root of that, of course, is this opening and closing tag, which is form. And now let's talk about the attributes of a form element itself. So the most common one, it is the action, or one of the most common. Um, and you saw that VS Code brought put that in there for us by default. So action is quite clear. It says, what should I do when the form is submitted? What action do you want it to be taken? And you can see here it says the URI of a program that processes the form. For example, it asks for the address of that program. Sometimes it is in your server. For example, you say, go to my server and use this file, PHP file, and process the form. Right now, we don't have such file, so it's not going to do anything. By default, it goes to the same page as the form. So right now it's on index.html. So by default, it will go there. So even if we don't provide it, it still does that. And but okay, but the good practice is to provide it even though you want to use the same page. So the next one is target. And if you watched my previous video again in basics of HTML, I cover these other elements such as tag, a tag, and links. And we have similar target on a links that says, where should I open a link when the user clicks on it? Should it be on another page or just the same page? So this is basically the same. Again, if you don't know any about those tags, please watch my other video. It's in the description. So the target says, you can see here, says, where do you want me to show the result of this form to the user? For example, sometimes, you submit the form and you get a pop-up or some window and says, thank you for submitting, or yes, the form was submitted successfully. And this one says, where do you want me to show that? In the self window, which is the same, and this is the default, or open a blank new tab, or the parent of this all pages if you have multiple pages, and the last one is top. Yes. And we usually don't use this because you can see HTML4, we don't use HTML4 anymore, it's HTML5. It says load the response, and then HTML5 load the response into the top level browsing context. So if you're like multiple pages ahead, this will go back to the top of that page. Now, the target, I personally don't provide it because we can handle pop-ups with JavaScript or other means. For now, we're just going to leave it right there because this is the default. All right, so this is the default, this is the default. Next one is very common, is the method. Now, this one is a bit, we're going to talk about it a bit more. And method asks for the HTTP, you can see here, the HTTP method that the browser uses to submit the form. And we have possible actions of post, get, and dialog. So let's talk about these methods, especially post and get, because those are the ones that we always use. And start with get because that is the default. Okay, so the method get appends the user input to the URL. So this is our URL, okay? And if we submit the form, it will create a question mark as a separator. In fact, if we hover over it, we can see, yeah, I had to write it small letters. So corresponds to the HTTP GET method, and you can see here, use a question mark as a separator, and the resultant URL is sent to the server. Use this method when the form has no side effects and contains only ASCII characters. Now, what it does, for example, we are searching something. Let's say I search for funny, right? When I click on it, it appends as a key value pairs. So search is the name we provided, and that's why I provided the name. Again, I will explain these. And funny is the value the user input. It shows in the URL. So we don't want to use get for sensitive data. For example, if you have a registration form and other forms like a credit card form or something, you never use get because that is very insecure. And so it's good for searches, filters, things that we want the user be able to see and probably bookmark the page. So if you have many filters and the user goes and say, okay, I want to save this page with all the filters that I applied, and that's where we use get method. So again, use it for searches and filters and the things that are visible in the URL. And also it is very limited because this URL is limited and it only goes to 2048 characters. So we can't really send a lot of data up there. So, and let's go to the post now. Post, what it does post, it will send the user inputs and the data within the body of the form. So it is not visible to the user, or it goes to the back server, of course, to the file the program we provided, and the program will be in charge of the security, and validating that inputs. So if we hover over it, it says corresponds to the HTTP post method from form data, are included in the body of the form. So it's not sent or appended to the URL anymore, and it is kind of like a package sent to the server, and it is very good, and it's the only method we use when we handling forms that are, they have sensitive data like email, password, credit card information, and so on, because we can send it back to the server without compromising the user information and then process it there. So it's a very useful method. And also there is no limitation, there is no size, so you can send large amounts of data like images, files, or so on. Of course, if you can't use it for searches or filters because users won't see this and won't be able to bookmark it. And in fact, because I set the method to post, right? Let me save it. And if I submit this, watch what happens. It says this page isn't working, even though I set this page, but because the method is post, it accepts some program to handle this post method. I don't have any. And the last one is kind of a silly one and almost never use it. So you can see dialog element. If we use the form inside the dialog element, so it's an HTML element, when we submit the form, so when you click on this submit button or search or whatever that the name is, it will close the form, which is kind of, so I mean, you kind of say, okay, what's the reason? So we never use that. I personally never used it before, and I will never use it because it's just silly. So method get is the default, and I'm gonna leave it there. The next attribute, which is kind of, you know, again, depending on your preference, you can use it. It's called autocomplete, and it's very clear what it does, and it expects two values, on or off. By default, it's on, and you can see here I get these because it's autocomplete is on. If I off it, turn it off, I don't get those anymore. So this is again, there might be situations you don't want autocomplete to come in. So maybe we should turn this off. And by default, it is on. I'm going to leave it there. So these are all default values I'm leaving there. The next one, which is again, I don't know, kind of, you could use it for some reason. I can't think of a reason when you want to use it. But it does. It says no validate. It's a Boolean attribute. Boolean means it either true or false, right? And if you provide it, it's true. It means it is true. If you don't provide it, it is false. What it does, by default, it is not there. So let me delete it again. And I'm going to add an attribute to my input called required. And it again, this says, by default, says this field cannot be empty. You see, this cannot be empty. However, if I provide that no validate attribute to my form, and then even though I have the required here, and then I submit the form, I still get no problem. You see, there's no error. I got some info appended to the URL, but because it was empty, there was no key. There was no value. I'm sorry. There was a key, but there was no value. So that is no validate. By default, it's not there. So I am going to remove it because we're keeping the defaults. The next one is name. Again, this is very, very self-explanatory. So imagine, for example, you have many forms on your page and you want to distinguish them and you want to have them, handle them by name later on. And this has to be a unique name, much like ID, you can see here, much like ID in other elements. This has to be a unique name. And the last one is called enctype, which is short for encoding type. And it says, you can see, when the value of method attribute is post, so it works with post. The enctype is this MIME type. We can go and see what that is, of the context, and it's used to submit the form to the server. So we're saying what kind of context we are submitting. So the encoding type should be what? By default is this one. If we are submitting just plain text, so we can just say text plain, so we don't expect anything but text. Or if we are expecting files, so if we want to give the ability to the user to upload files, we should provide this encoding type or enctype as multipart form data. So multipart and form data. But by default is on application. So these are the form attributes that we usually use on the form element itself. And you can see here, these are the default. All of them are default attributes with their values, except this one. Of course, this is just, I can delete it. So everything here is default. Now we're going to dig in and jump in and talk about all the elements within. All right, let's talk about the form elements and what goes inside the form. So I formatted my document just by, format document. That's why these look like this. And I deleted that input and button because I want to start over. So let's just start over. Input, right? It was oops, what did I do? Name search. So this is what I had for the input before. And input is the most used element, the most common element in the form. And it is defined by its type. So right now, by default, we have this input type text, and this is the default attribute type text. So even if we don't provide it, it will be a single line input text, text input. And then, of course, the name attribute, which goes on almost every input because we want to use it. Again, remember when we selected something up there, it says it brings the name as the key, and whatever the user input, the user put in there will be the value. So I will cover all these types later in the video. But for now, let's move on. Input and label. So label, I think it's very clear what it does. It is provide a label. It provides a label for the inputs. Now, let me first move this up. I'm holding Alt and pressing up arrow on my keyboard. And so it looks better. It has to be on the left, right? We have this for attribute on the label element. And what it says it asks for the name of the input where we want to link these two together. So basically we're saying this label belongs to this input. Sometimes we provide the ID. It is very useful to provide the ID instead of the name because in some cases the field is so small, like a selection button, and the user cannot just click on that tiny little square. So they can easily click on the text and just use that one. And I will show you as an example as I'm walking you through these elements. So these are the most common ones, label and input, and we use them all the time. There are a lot of them actually, but this is, I would say, yeah, input is the most used. So, and a label is also very useful for screen readers. Again, we talked about accessibility a little bit in my previous video, and we have to provide the label with the right for attribute so that the screen reader knows this field here asks for the search query. And it is very important. That is label and input. Now, I'm going to talk about the next element. So it is called a field set. Okay. So a field set, basically, it provides a kind of a separator between, form elements or group them together. All right. So, and I will use a field set because I want to have spaces between the form elements. So whatever we put in here, you can see this kind of a default border goes around it. It's kind of fun. So, and it's useful if we're not providing any CSS. These days, because we work with CSS and JavaScript and all sorts of things, we usually don't use field set anymore. We use our own, we style the our form with CSS. And I'm gonna provide BR as break line. So we have some, I'm sorry, it has to be 2 at least. Yeah, we have some space over there. It has to, I provided 2 because these are inline element, and basically this BR is it's here. So we have one line and then we have another line. So the next one is select. The next element, it is select, and it gives the ability of selection to the user, and you can see it gives drop down menu sort of thing, and I have no data right now, so that's why it's empty. Select asks for a name, much like input, so I'm gonna call it favorite colors or color, and of course the ID, much like here, and some other attributes which I will explain. Now in the select we have options. So option, what option do we want to give to the user? To choose a color, right? So we provide the options. Let's say I have 3. I want to say blue. Is that, why did I type it that way? So red and green, for example. And the values should be the same, of course, right? Now I will explain in a second what are these. Let me type it. It's kind of difficult to type and talk at the same time. All right, so let me explain this select element. And again, select gives the ability to the user to select an option or multiple options from the provided options. And usually it is shown as a drop-down menu, but we can change it in a second. And the name we provide, remember, we should use the name so that our program in the backend on the server knows how to address these. So these names are used as the key for the values which is provided by the user. And remember, we already provided search funny, for example. So search was the name, funny was the value where the user provided for us. So here's the same. If I save this and go here and say funny again and choose blue, I don't have a submit button, but I can just press enter. You can see here it says search funny and favorite color blue. And by default, when we submit the form, everything goes back to default. So empty and then red as the first argument. Maybe I should provide that button again so we have something to click on. And put these BRs again here. Just have some space. Okay, so now we have another way, another input for the user. Now, sometimes you want the default value not to be the first one, because by default, the first one will be shown as the default value. Sometimes you want this third one or some other value. So we have on the option element, we have the attribute called selected, as you can see, and it will make that option as the default value. Right now, it's green. So that's one way to make a default value visible to the user. On the select element itself, we have also some attributes we can use. For example, we can say, we can provide a size and say how many of these options we want it to be visible to the user at first. If we say 3, for example, because we have 3, all of them will be visible, and the user has this kind of a drop down, what is like a scroll bar thing. Sorry. So if we have a lot of options and we want the user to see them all at once for some reason, we can do this, but it is not a good practice. So by default it's 1, of course, and we're going to keep it that way. The other attribute it is useful we can use, it is called multiple. I wouldn't call this useful. And if I change this size back to 3 again, maybe just even 7, doesn't matter. And the multiple attribute allows the user to select multiple options. However, in a normal circumstances, when you click on it, just one is selected. So you have to hold down your control on your keyboard or shift, and select, and then you get multiple options. Let's see what happens if I select red and blue and submit it. We can see here we have search funny and favorite color red and favorite color blue. So this is not a good option really, because there is actually an input select type or checkbox, input checkbox, where you can give the ability to the user to just checkbox their options. So I wouldn't recommend this at all. Don't use select with the multiple attribute unless there is a specific reason for it. So that is the attribute we can use. So that's select and options. One of the other elements that are useful today, we can use it, it's called a legend. So a legend element, let's hover over it, it says represents a caption for the rest of the contents of the legend element's parent field set. So remember we said field set is this kind of a border box thingy, and then we have the legend. So we can say, for example, user preference, and you can see how it looks. It goes really nicely between the lines, and it's a caption, or it's a kind of like a title for that field set that we are using. So it's a good way to separate sections of the form. And again, this is kind of the old school kind of way. We use CSS these days, JavaScript, to cover that. But it's nice. It's a nice way to use it for, screen readers. The other element we can use, of course, is a text area. A text area represents a text area. That's pretty clear, right? And by default, again, we have the name, we have the ID, and columns, calls for short, and rows. So a text area is a big area for text input, and you can press enter for new lines, and you can add as much text as you want. And the user has the ability to resize it by default. And these columns and rows represent how many columns and rows initially this should be, how big or small. So if we say, for example, 10 columns or 5 rows, it will become smaller. This actually can be done by CSS as well. So if you provide a style and says width, I don't know, 300 pixel, this will go like that. But we're not talking about CSS right now. We're talking about HTML and specifically forms. So the next element is button, and we already have a button. So by default, the button type is submit, and it will submit the form. However, we have other values we can provide. For example, submit, which is the default, which submits the form. The reset, it's a good way to reset the form. Let's use that. For example, we say, we have a big form and the user is inputting all these things, red, and then it's okay. Now I want to delete all of this. They can just click on the reset. It goes back to the initial way that it was. So we have reset, and we have also button. The button has no default behavior. It can have a client side. So if we type, for example, button as button, it doesn't do anything. So see, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't submit the form. But you can say with JavaScript or the backend that when I click on this button, what should happen. So I'm gonna, for now, change it back to submit, which is default. All right, the next element we're gonna use is data list. So data list represents a predefined options for the user, where they can just choose from the options like select, but also have the ability to type in their own. So with select, they don't have the option to add to it. However, with data list, we have that option. So we can just provide more options. For example, I want to call this pets. So I'm going to provide dog and cat and fish. Okay, and this, however, you see data list by default is hidden. It is hidden because if you hover over it, it says, you see, it represents nothing, and it needs another input to show these options. So if we provide an input, which is the type text by default, this also has the attribute list, and it asks for the ID of the list. So we're going to give this ID of pets, and the same goes for the list in the input, on the input element. So if I save it now, I have this input text where the user can type their pets or their favorite pets, or just select one of these. So if none of these is, the one that I want, I can just type in my own, like, I don't know, horse, for example. So this will work. And again, we can get this information by providing a pet's name. And then when the user says dog, submit, up here you can see it says pets equals to dog. Now, we also have these options. We don't need to provide this because we're already getting the values, right? Now, if I provide a content between these two tags for the option, say, I don't know, a nice dog. I don't know, but anything. In some cases, you might need to provide more information. So when the user clicks on it, they have a kind of a explanation, I would say, for that option, so what that is. You could do that, but it's really up to you. Okay, the next element we have is called output, and we can see it represents the result of a calculation performed by the application. So this requires a bit of JavaScript or a script. And what it does, it just shows the output of some actions. So let's say, I'm just going to say output for now. It just shows the text, nothing really fancy, it's just an element. But we are going to give it a name, right? Because we're going to address it. We're going to call it, we need the name. We're going to call it just output, right? Now, we want to change it. For example, I want when the user types something in the search field, it will show up down here. This is kind of silly, but imagine this is kind of a calculation for some reason. So we need to add some script to the form itself. And this is part of, it's JavaScript. So if you don't know, don't worry about these things. I'm using this just to show you what does this output do. I'm going to say on input function, when I type something on the form, my output, am I typing it? Yeah. Dot value, the value of my input should equal to my search value. Okay, so basically I'm saying put the content of this output equals to the search. If I type here, this should change this one. There we go. That's what output does. So imagine again, this is a calculation and you want to show the user what's going on and what's the calculation. Say like I don't know, they're calculating something. Anyway, so that's output, another element. All right, the other element, and it is not so much useful, it's called option group or OPT group for short. And for example, it is useful when you want to group your options. Say we have this select, okay, of favorite colors, and now we want to group them by, I don't know, some other ways. So what we can do, just put these options in an opt group, okay? Now format it. Now this one asks for a label. So we can give this a label and say primary colors, for example, and then have another one. Let me copy paste this one. Let's call this secondary. And now we have, I don't want the selected anymore on this one, but let's say we have orange. I'm not going to change that. This is just to show you on the screen. Orange, purple, and white. So now if I open this one, and you can see we have kind of groups of primary color and secondary, and those opt group or option group, it's not selectable. But this is a good way if you have different select in the same category. Say you have cars and then you want to categorize them by their make or, I don't know, country of make or whatever. So that's another one, and that's the last one. So these are the form elements, and now we are going to talk about input types. All right, let's talk about input types, and later on we talk about input attributes. So let's just start with types, and I deleted everything. I also have some styles just for my field sets, just give them some space on the top and bottom. And let's dig in. I'm going to create a field set first, just to, have a nice organized form. The first one, of course, is type text by default. And remember, we talked about form elements where we could provide field set and legends of what they are. So I'm going to use those to keep this organized as much as I can. I'm going to call this a text field right there. So input type text is the single line input text, and by default it's always text. That's the first one. Let's go to the next one. Another field set, and another input of type button, and we're going to go through all of this. So we're going one by one. Button, or btn for short, or whatever, is a button, just like the element button. And when we save it, if there is no value, because it's an input, it doesn't have anything in it. It's just the default styles. We have some padding, some color, and so on. So we can just provide a value, submit, sorry. And there it is. It just looks exactly like the button we used before. And remember, we had to provide a type, either submit or reset. So there we go. So we have a submit and reset button now. Those are other ones. Another field set. Let's see. Input. The next one is checkbox. Checkbox is very useful for giving the user the ability to, select different or multiple choices. Remember, we had the select element, and I said that's not a good idea if we want to give the ability to the user to select multiple things. And that's why we are using this. We are using input type checkbox, multi, or just selection. I'm just gonna add a legend. So if the user wants to select these selections or these checkboxes, it's quite difficult because they have to select these tiny little boxes, and even though I'm 200% zoomed in, it's still difficult. And you can see I can select both because, yeah, it's a checkbox. It gives me the ability. Now, for example, this I want to ask for the favorite color of the user, so I can name them favorite color. However, the ID, it's going to be different, right? So this one is for the red and this one is for the blue. Now, if I provide the same ID that I just provided for my inputs and type them into the for attribute of the label, then I am able to click on the label itself and select the thing I want, select this checkbox I want. So if I submit it, you can see favorite color on and favorite color on. And remember, we have to provide the value to get the actual value up there in the form. So, and next one, field set. Don't worry, again, I will talk about the attributes. Sorry, field set. Input, next one, color. I think it's very clear what it does. Color, ability to choose the color. Next one is date. It allows you to pick a date, just a day, month, and the year. So next one is date time and date time local. It's very clear what it does, and it not only you can pick the date, but also the time, either in local time or not local time. Let me give this a legend of, I don't know, others. For now, doesn't have really specific reason. Let's go to another field set. Another input we have is called an email. And this is a nice, very useful input type. And it actually validates the email by default. So we don't need to add other validations. So if I add a label so we know what we're talking about, and also a legend. So for example, this is your user info section. So we are asking for the email. Now, if I type something that is not an email and submit it, you see the browser gives me the error because we are saying this type of this field should be email. So it has to follow the pattern of an email. Sorry, I clicked save, submit, and it works. The other one that is pretty much like email. So I'm going to create a break line first and a label for password. So, and the input type password. And much like email that checks for the pattern of the email, password gives us some default behavior like this. It doesn't show the characters that are being typed on the screen. So I know what I'm typing, but you don't because everything is hidden. So that's a very good input type. We use it all the time for forms. The other input that is also goes along with this user info and sensitive data, it's called a hidden, it's a hidden input type. And of course it's hidden as the type says, but if I give it a name of secret, right, and a value of secret code, right? Usually when we are submitting a form with sensitive data, and remember the method is post, so the user cannot see, there is a hidden input type with a hash value and a name that goes back to the server to validate and make sure the form is valid and secure. So that's what hidden input is used for security reasons. And that's why I put it in the same field set. Let's create another field set and let's say input. So we covered date, email, file. File is very clear what it does, and it gives the ability to the user to select a file if they want to upload, if your form has the ability to upload files. There. What else we have? Input. Next, hidden, we covered that one. Image. So this is, I don't know, it kind of depends on you. So let me actually, I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. So type image asks for a source. It's an image, it's an input type image. And if we provide a source, which is my logo, my image, and give it a width of 50 because it's too big. I don't want it to be too big. Now this behaves as a submit button. Sometimes you want your form to have a very nice submit, very distinguished submit button. So you can provide an image, and if I click on it, it will submit the form. You can see all these things go up there. So that's image. What else we have? Input, type month. We can put it with the date and time. So input type month. Very clear, it selects the month and the year. Since we are in the date and time, we have also, so we covered month, right? We also have week. Okay, that's the week. For example, the 31st week of the year 2023. And we also have time, only time. So these are all time, date, plus color. And it's very clear. Sometimes you just want the time, sometimes you just want the week. So these are the inputs we can use. Let's go back to the user or the file. Let's say here, legend, user, info, files. I don't know. Extra, I don't know. So for example, we have the ability to provide, we have type, range, number. So type number, for example, is very clear what it does. Again, it gives the ability to add numbers. You cannot type letters, you can see here. And I can only type numbers or using these arrows going one up and down. We can also provide a min attribute that the minimum number should be 10, the maximum should be, for example, 15. Now, if I type 1, it works, but if I submit it, it says it has to be greater or equal to 10. So if I click on these arrows, it starts with 10 and goes all the way up to 15, not more than that. And since we are in type, number, we have also type range. And it kind of acts the same way as this number. So if I provide a min and max, it gives me this slider where it starts with the minimum number, which is 10 for us. So 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. That's another way to, give the ability to the user to select a range. All right, so this is getting too much, so I'm going to create another field set and see what inputs we have missed. All right, we did the image, we did the month, number, password, radio. Did I? No. So I will do the radio. So let's skip over radio. We did the range, which is this blue one. Reset is the same as reset button. So submit and reset are the same. And search, okay, let's do search. And I'm going to go up. I'm going to delete this. I'm going to go up in the very first field and say input type search. This is, again, might be silly because nowadays we can just do all of this with CSS and JavaScript. But let's say there is no JavaScript or CSS. A search type gives the user the ability to clear that field by this button. That's it. That's the only difference. So it's pretty much like a text field, but it has this tiny little button next to it. That's it. And let's talk about the radio. So remember, we had here selections and we had the radio. We had the checkbox type. Now I'm going to copy all of this and paste it. So we have, well, actually, let me start over just to be clear. We have the input type of radio. Radio, the difference between radio and checkbox is that with radio, you can only select one. So I'm going to give it pets, ID of pets. I'm sorry, the name pets, ID dog, and label for it for the dog, sorry, and the content should be dog. It looks like that. And I can actually, again, provide BRs, two of them, so we have underneath each other. So if I create another one with the same name, this is important. It has to be the same name, like select checkbox. And instead of dog, I'm going to say cat with the same ID, because I want to be able to click on the label and select that radio button. So, and you can see I cannot select both of them, unlike the checkbox. It has to be only one. The reason, sorry, I just clicked somewhere. The reason I say the names must be same, if I change the name, so basically I am changing the category or the group, right? Now they are two different groups, so I can select both. So this is not what we want. Okay, so let me see what I missed. Let's go back to the input. We covered a button, checkbox, color, date, time, file, email, number, month, image, password, radio, range, reset, which is the reset button again. Search, we did it. Submit is the submit button, and which is actually right there. Tell, text is the default one. So it's the default text input. So it's tell and URL left. So let's just start with tell, which is short for telephone. It's down here. I'm going to create an field set. I'm sorry, making myself confused. In field set with a legend of phone and URL. So phone, if I give it a label, sorry again, sorry. Telephone is basically, again, an input text field. However, it also has this attribute called pattern. Now, pattern, we can provide a regular expression code, or regex for short. And this one gives us, for example, the pattern that it should be written. For example, if I type right now anything, it would work. It doesn't give me any error because there is no pattern. However, I say from number to 9, 0 to 9, and then there has to be a dash, and then again, or three of them. For example, three numbers. Where's the there? And then a dash. This is a pattern. It is regex. I really don't like this regex because it's a whole new program kind of thing, and it's way. It can be its own course, but it's kind of very confusing. Again, 0 to 9, and another three numbers. So I'm saying three numbers between 0 to 9. So basically, this should be the pattern. Oops, not 4. This should be the pattern. Now, if I do four numbers, let me save this first. So 1, 2, just a number, submit. You see, it's not, and it doesn't tell me, this is the problem. It doesn't tell me what format should I follow. So how would the user know? So the only pattern would work, even if I say 2 and then 4, that doesn't work. It has to be 3 number and dash and then another 3 number. That works. So if we do this, we have to provide some sort of a tag and says, for example, pattern should be so 111-111. So this should be the pattern. So the user knows what pattern should follow. Now, in a modern development, we don't do this. We actually, or even if we do it, with JavaScript, we provide a way so when the user input numbers, we have the dash automatically, fill in. So yeah, that's tell. I'll actually leave it there. The other one was URL, and I'm gonna create BRs again, BR, and a label that says URL input type URL. This one again, like email, maybe this is too much. Like email that checked for the pattern of the email, this does the same thing. If I provide something silly, it will say, please, this is not a URL. So I have to follow the convention and say https://.com, for example. Now it works. So URL accepts a URL. And that's all the input fields we have, guys. Input types, sorry. I'm losing my voice. So we covered all of this, and now we're going to talk about the attributes. All right. Let's just start with the attributes, and we covered actually most of them, like this type, name, ID, for. So, but we're going to cover the ones that we haven't. Let's just start with the value, and remember we provided value for these buttons, for example, right? Now the value attribute. So the value attribute provides an initial value for the input. So if we say, for example, I don't know, search. You see, search. You see what happens there? So the user actually has to come and delete this. Now this would not work. This is not a good practice and would not work for type text, but it is necessary, in fact, for these types. So we need to provide a value for these selections or checkboxes or radios to see actually what we are selecting. Otherwise, remember, it would just say on or off. So the first one is attribute value, which provides an initial value for the input field. The next attribute is called read only, and that's very self-explanatory. It says read only, and you can see here I can click on it, but I cannot type. So I'm going to leave that read only here and jump to the next attribute, and I will explain it. We have another attribute called placeholder, and as the name says, it's a placeholder. So remember, before we provided the value search where the user had to delete it. With the placeholder, you don't have to delete it. It's just a grayed out text where the user can type on it. Now, because I provided the read only, I cannot type anything. Now let's say I have the value as well with the same text, search. Let me say I don't know, hello. Now, value overrides placeholder. We have to consider that. Okay. So if I have a value placeholder, it is not shown. Now, because I have the read only, this is read only. So I cannot type anything, I cannot delete anything. However, the user can come out and select and copy it. Okay, so that's what we need to keep in mind. Read only and placeholder. So actually, I'm going to keep him here for now. The next one is disabled. It is very clear what it does again. Disabled, look what happens to this field if I save it. Bam. It grazes, it grazes, it grays out the whole field and you cannot do anything anymore. So it disables the that input. So for example, we have this color here. Let's find it. It is others, color. So if I choose disabled, see, now I cannot select it. It's no use. Sometimes it is useful where you want to, for example, disable the button until everything is filled and validated, and then you enable it with JavaScript. So that's what it's good for. All right, so the next one is the size, and it works on input text fields. So the ones like this one, input type text, search, password, email. And if you provide a size, let's say 5, it changes the visible field width. Now, I can still type, but it is very small. So by default, that is 20, this. So we can change the size of a field. For example, if you have if you want a longer field, you can provide a size attribute. So that is, I'm going to leave it in there, size. All right, so the next attribute is called max length. Let's hover over it, see if VS Code helps us. No, so it doesn't matter. Max length tells us what is the maximum characters that can be typed into this field. For example, I say 5, right? Now let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Bam, 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 bam. It doesn't work. However, it doesn't tell us. You can see there's no feedback that says, okay, you reached this limit. So we need to provide that with JavaScript if we want to use this max length, right? And I'm going to leave as 10, for example. For some reason, maybe you don't want the user to submit a long text. And actually, we do use that. Just kind of going on the side here. For example, remember I said we have validations on the server side, and usually we come in and says not more than 250 characters, for example, because what kind of a name is more than 250 50 characters? It doesn't make sense, and it's not good. It's yeah, we need to check we validate the user input. All right, so the next attributes are min and max. We provided them for numbers and ranges here, and it provides, it talks about the minimum value and the maximum allowed value. So if you want to create a range of valid input, you can use min and max, and it goes for the dates, the time, and numbers and ranges. For example, you see we have the month here, and I just added this for practice. But if I say minimum 2022 12, doesn't matter, and the maximum is 2023 12. So this format, you can find it on MDN references. So if you go to this, you can find it because it's different for the week and the date. So, but if I go to the month input, which is this one, you can see I have only December 2022 to December 2023. That's the range. So that's min and max. The other one, we talked about it in the select menu, select element, I'm sorry. And that was the multiple attribute. Now, this could be used for files too. So remember here, you could not select 2. You can see I'm trying to select 2. I can't. So if I go to my file input, if I can find it, there it is. and just say multiple, right? And if I go here now, I can select 2. There we go, 2, and it gives me 2 files. So that's another attribute. The pattern attribute, we talked about it. It provides, it asks for a regex or a regular expressions uh, format, which is part of JavaScript. And it goes for tell, or it goes with many fields, in fact, because uh, even with text, you can provide what sort of a text or what pattern do you expect from the user. Sometimes you just want the area code and of a country, right? Of the district or something. And that's, you provide, for example, it has to be only 3 letters or 3 numbers or 2 letters, 1 number. These are all done with regular expression patterns. We talked about the placeholder, of course, up here. A placeholder goes in to show the user what pattern you are asking. So instead of adding a paragraph here, which I did before, a better maybe a better place would be just using the pattern as a placeholder. Now, in this case, I actually suggest to do it because when the user starts typing, the placeholder disappears. So, but in many cases like the email, most people know, everybody knows how email should look like. So you can just add a placeholder in case you want to give more tips to the user. So we called, the next one is called required. We talked about it briefly before. And if I go on my very first, the search field, let's say, not the very first, and it say this one is required. Okay, so because I'm saying this is required, now I submit the form, it will not submit the form. This is good because, this is, you want some fields not to be empty, and you provide this one. You could still, check for validation on the back end, but this is for your job front end or HTML side. So required makes sure the field is filled in and it is filled correctly. Okay, so the next one is called step, the next attribute, and it works with numbers, range, and dates and time. And if I provide a step attribute, and it asks for a number, for example, 1. No, 1 is the default, sorry, 2. So, like you would normally go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let me start this with from 0, okay? So you go 1 to 15, right? Now here, if I say step 2, it goes 2, 4, 6, and you get the idea, right? The same thing with the date. So remember here we said the minimum month on our month selector should be 12 December 2022 to December 2023. Now if I say the step should be 2, right? We can only select every 2, so not the kind of like even numbers. So that is the step. Sometimes it could be useful. The next attribute that is quite useful, it is called autofocus, and that is used when with the pages load, we want this cursor to be on that field. For example, I want the focus to be on the email when the page, which is kind of silly in this one, but it usually starts on the top. But for the sake of just practice, if I find my email input right here, and I want to say this should be auto focus, you have all of this, but you can see auto focus. Now, if I reload, let me delete all of this extra code. You see, it went to my email. So even if I'm here on search and reload, jumps to the email because I'm saying auto focus on the email. So the next attributes are width and height. So, and it goes for the image. And we usually provide this so we will not have a problem when the page is loading. If we don't provide it and we just rely on CSS, it can have some problems because sometimes it doesn't load or it loads slow. So that's very clear, the width and the height of the image. All right, the next one is the list attribute, which we talked about it. And remember, we used it in the form elements just a while back. So for example, this list, I'm gonna take out this disabled and read only here, and also the value, and just gonna add list. Okay, so remember the list attribute asks for a predefined option, and we could provide this by adding data list, which again we covered it, list or my list. So if I have a data list with the ID of my list, this shows up in this one. The next attribute that goes on the input as well as the form is autocomplete. Remember, actually, when we have it right here, actually. Yeah, autocomplete is on by default, and we could actually turn it off for a specific, fields. So right now, none of these have autocomplete, right? So yeah, I don't have autocomplete for any of this, but you could actually turn it on and off by default and just say autocomplete, for example, on. Again, that doesn't work because I don't have anything here on this page. So say I don't want autocomplete for this one, off. That's it. So that can go specific for inputs. All right. And that's about it, guys. That's all about forms and inputs and elements within the form and what we can do. And again, remember, this is only the HTML side of it, and there is a lot going on in the back end of a form, but this is what we can do with HTML. So I hope this has been helpful, and I hope I covered most of the things. I know I haven't covered everything, but it's a huge thing. But I covered the most important ones, the ones that are actually useful. And I hope you liked the video and it's been helpful. So please don't forget to like and subscribe and share if you really like the video. And I will catch you at the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.